If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. I'd hammer out danger, I'd hammer out a warning, I'd hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters.
Well, sisters and brothers, welcome to this morning's panel, which is called The New Cold War, What's Driving It, and Will It Escalate? My name's Bill Doares. I'm with the International Action Center, and I'll be chairing the panel and making an opening presentation. We also have today Meejin Richard and Seyeon Lee from Nodutdol for Korean Community Development, will speak on the U.S. shift to the Asia Pacific and the specific reference to Korea. We have Abayomi Azikiwe from Pan-African Newswire and the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, who will speak about AFRICOM and imperialism, anti-imperialist resistance in Africa. We have Berta Joubert-Ceci, who's also with the International Action Center in Philadelphia and a board member of the Women's International Democratic Federation, who has traveled extensively and written extensively about Latin America and will speak on Venezuela and the imperialism and the anti-imperialist struggle in Latin America today. And we have Jess Sundin, who is a founder of the Anti-War Committee in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, and has also been targeted as among 23 anti-war activists who've been targeted by the FBI in a witch hunt against the anti-war movement and solidarity movement. We'll speak about repression and the war at home. And the context of this is the New Cold War. This year will be 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the end of the global struggle that was called the Cold War. It wasn't very cold in Korea or Vietnam or Angola or Central America or many other parts of the world. And it marks 100 years since the start of World War I, the war to end all wars, and World War II, which is the bloodiest war, and 75 years since the start of World War II, which was the bloodiest war in history. Over 100 million people died in those two wars. World War II alone killed about 5% of the world's population, and of those, the largest number, 27 million, were in the Soviet Union. And today, as we speak, despite President Obama's mendacious speech at West Point last week, and mendacious as it was, and as arrogant as it was, saying that the United States is the only indispensable nation in the world, meaning all the others are dispensable, of course. And the Pentagon hates him for that speech because they consider Obama a coward for not invading Syria or bombing Syria and not going all out to war in the Ukraine, just like they considered Kennedy a coward for not invading Cuba and sending U.S. planes to Cuba and starting World War III back then. But that doesn't mean that they're not all going in the same direction. And as we speak, the United States is basically waging world war by proxy on 4 continents. In Ukraine, in the former Soviet Union, the United States and the European Union have supported a right-wing coup whose main enforcers have been openly fascist, pro-fascist, the political descendants of the Nazi collaborators who worked with the German occupation in World War II, who are now, who a few weeks ago burned down a union hall in Odessa and killing 41 people, who are now shelling cities in eastern Ukraine, where workers who they are calling Russians or pro-Russians, but are people of all nationalities, Russian, Ukrainian, Tatar, all the nationalities that live in Ukraine. You don't have to be Russian to not want to have your pension cut in half. You don't have to be Russian speaking to not want your your wages cut in half if you're a public sector employee, not want to live under an IMF-imposed austerity regime. And the rebellion in Donetsk and Lugansk and the eastern Ukraine is a completely justified struggle against austerity and against the expansion of NATO into the former Soviet Union. In Syria, the United States is stepping up arms to the so-called rebels, who are an uneasy alliance of so-called moderates who are openly and completely pro-United States, and Takfiri forces, the same kind of forces the United States has worked with since Afghanistan in the 70s, who were fighting for their perverted version of an Islamic State, to take away the basic social rights that people in Syria have under the nationalist government. And the war in Syria is really also aimed at Iran, which is still the target of U.S. sanctions. The war in Syria has killed perhaps 150,000 people now. It's displaced a third of the country. But there are elections happening on Tuesday, and already hundreds of thousands of people, over 1 million Syrians in exile, have voted where they've been allowed to vote. In Lebanon and Jordan have cast their votes in this election that the United States considers fraudulent, but of course we know what Washington's idea of democracy in the Middle East is. It's Saudi Arabia and Israel. In Venezuela, the United States is organizing, is funding covert operations designed at overthrowing the government of Nicolas Maduro, the successor to Hugo Chavez, and we'll hear more about that later from Comrade Berta. In Africa, they're carrying out operations almost every day, drone strikes and the expansion of AFRICOM. And then there's the Pacific, so-called Pacific Shift, where the U.S. military is shifting forces to, they make it sound like a dance move or something, but they're shifting military forces. They're tilting to the Pacific. Against whom? Against what? Against the people there. You know, that's, now they've promised to back Japan in any possible confrontation with China, and they have. And Chuck Hagel is now on his way to a conference, a so-called security conference in the Asia Pacific, and he's already talking belligerently again against China and the so-called Chinese threat. What's the material basis for all this? The 20th century was a century of imperialist war, as you said. The two world wars happened when Europe's so-called great powers, having carved up Africa and much of Asia in the 19th century, turned on each other. Even Woodrow Wilson admitted that at first. He said World War I happened because Britain owned the earth and Germany wanted it. Then when his financial backers of the House of Morgan decided they were going to lose money if Britain and France lost the war, he changed his tune and called it a war to keep the world safe for democracy and end all wars, and sent 1 million U.S. GIs over there to bail out the countries who had borrowed the most from the Morgan banks. World War II, bloodiest war in history, which was also, and of course the United States, which had become an imperialist power, had entered the world stage with the conquest of the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba and Hawaii at the end of the 19th century. And Japan, which was busy building a colonial empire in Korea and China, they joined in. And the cause of this war, these two wars, are the cause of the same thing that's the cause of imperialism. The one thing that is unique, the crisis that's unique to the capitalist system, which is too much. They're the only system in history that goes into crisis when there is more produced than can be sold at a profit, more profits made that can be reinvested at a profit. It's what Karl Marx, and he was writing before competitive capitalism had morphed into imperialism, said that epidemic, which in all earlier epochs would have been deemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. And he went on, Marx and Engels went on to say in the Communist Manifesto, how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by the enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other, by the conquest of new markets and the more thorough exploitation of old ones. And indeed, the massive destruction of productive forces in World War II, in World War I and World War II, it not only got the United States out of economic crisis, it was the best thing that ever happened for corporate America. The Wall Street bankers, many of whom had supported Hitler and Mussolini in the 30s, World War I had left most of Europe, the colonial powers of Europe, in debt to U.S. banks, and World War II left the United States just at the center of the world economy because Europe and Eurasia, the Soviet Union, Japan lay in ruins. And it's a position that the United States has tried to maintain by force and violence ever since. The nuclear embers on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had not yet cooled before the United States and Britain launched the so-called Cold War. One of the most monstrous acts in history when you consider that all the suffering that the people around the world had undergone in World War II. The Soviet Union, which had borne the brunt of the war against Hitler, had 27 million dead. How many cities destroyed, towns and farms destroyed, people, children orphaned, men and women widowed, people without arms and legs paralyzed. And suddenly they were forced into a nuclear arms race with the United States. And within 5 years, the United States was waging a genocidal war in Korea. But all this is great. All this is great if you look at the world. If you're a banker on Wall Street, if you own industry that's been untouched by war. But World War II also had a downside. World War I and World War II also had a downside. It wasn't all just happiness and making money. The First World War ended with the world's first socialist revolution, with the working class seizing power in the former Russian Empire and creating the Soviet Union. And World War II ended with the Soviet Army liberating East Europe, which was followed quickly by the Chinese Revolution and the Korean Revolution and the liberation struggle in Vietnam, and it spread to Cuba 10 years later. A whole area of the world was closed off to imperialism, was closed off to exploitation. And for 45 years, trillions and trillions of dollars, millions and millions of lives were lost to destroy that socialist bloc, which cannot also be separated from the rising national liberation struggles in Africa and Latin America and Asia. And ultimately it succeeded when China opened its doors to Western capital, and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was tantamount to the destruction that it unleashed, the massive shutdowns of factories, the drop in life expectancy all across East Europe and the USSR, Central Asia, was tantamount to the effect of a major war. What's his name? Ruckhiser, not William, Louis Ruckhiser, on New Year's Eve 2000, the turn of the century, said, "We are now in this longest peacetime recovery or expansion, meaning the 90s, which we hope will go on forever, lays to rest the myth that the United States economy can only prosper in time of war." But in fact, the 90s were a time of war, because the destruction happening in the former socialist countries and those countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America that had traded with it and had economic relations with the socialist camp, the effect was like that of a war. Life expectancy dropped by 10 to 15 years in the USSR, in the former USSR. To name just one example. Countries were forced to open their doors to the IMF, who'd been able to refuse to do that before. But it didn't last, because capitalists are capitalists, and at that time, the U.S. share of world production in the 90s rose for the first time since the 1950s. The dollar became the world's shot up in value as it became the de facto currency of the former Eastern Bloc. But by 1998, there was another crisis that was called the East Asian financial crisis. But it was the same thing: overproduction of commodities and capital, and especially oil. And it led to war in Yugoslavia and Iraq. So today, the socialist camp has been reduced to a few outposts. The United States would seem to be dominant. What is it that's driving the U.S. administration? The U.S. doesn't matter which administration; they're both in the pockets of the same corporations, in the direction of global conflict. And once again, when you think of the socialist camp, the great revolutionary events of the 20th century, what is its legacy? Was it all for nothing, this great struggle? No, it left tremendous. I mean, for workers in the United States, we owe unions and the minimum wage and unemployment compensation and all those things to the not just to the heroic struggles waged by workers here and the sit-down struggles and the civil rights movement of the 60s, but that was due to a global movement. We would not have won that on our own. All over the world, there are social gains achieved by that. But I think the biggest single legacy was the liberation of productive forces to develop in countries that have been held back by imperialism. China, at the time of the revolution in 1949, could not even manufacture an aspirin. Today, it's the world's second largest industrial power. The world capitalist economy, dominated by U.S. corporations, has no room for the vast productive capacity that was left behind by the socialist camp. It has no room for the African Union, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Bolivarian Alliance of Our America, ALBA. It has no room for the rising bloc of BRICS countries, so-called Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which Iran is now seeking to join. And once again, it's material forces at work. The need to stamp out that capitalism is a constant struggle to suppress the very productive forces itself that it has generated, but that capitalism has actually become an absolute brake on world production on a world scale. I want to give one specific example before I end, and that's oil, the world's most profitable commodity. There's a common idea that the wars in Iraq and so on were to get oil. The problem of capitalism is not shortage. Shortage is great, drives up prices, you make a lot of money. The problem of capitalism, especially monopoly capitalism, is too much. And the war in Iraq was a bonanza for the oil companies. People often say the U.S. is hurting its own interests, they're blundering, they're doing this. If somebody consistently acts against what you perceive to be their interests, perhaps their interests are not what you perceive them to be. And the war, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, the price of oil had fallen. In the 1998 crisis, the price of oil fell below $11 a barrel. After the Iraq War, it rose steadily up to over $100 a barrel, and that opened up a huge new market for capital investment. Where? Not in Iraq, in the United States, in Canada, in the natural gas fields of the hydraulic shale rock, the shale rock across the United States that's now being subject to so-called fracking, hydraulic fracturing. The tar sands of Canada, the Keystone XL pipeline, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline that brings natural gas from former Soviet Central Asia to the Mediterranean that's owned by British Petroleum. The Iraq War made all these projects profitable. And but by 2008, the price of oil was falling again. And so you had war in Syria, the targeting of Iran for sanctions, the sanctions against Sudan, the bombing of Libya. We're dealing with a system to which war is as necessary as is economic crisis. It's an inevitable product of that system, and but particularly U.S. imperialism in its most moribund stage has reached the stage where, in my view, it requires destruction to survive. It can only be, that was always true of imperialism, but on a scale unknown. It can only maintain its position in the center of the world economy by destruction and turmoil elsewhere in the world, which also drives capital into the United States. And every time there's a crisis in the Middle East or East Europe, you'll see the flow of capital into U.S. banks. It keeps the U.S. at the center of the world economy. It keeps people needing U.S. arms. Keeps the dollar solvent. So anyway, I've talked enough. Our next, I'll turn the floor over to Meijin and Seyeon from Nodutdol, who will talk about developments in the Asia Pacific and particularly Korea.
So we thought you might be sleepy, so we brought some snacks too. During our presentation, it's seen as a bread. So while Seyeon sets up our PowerPoint, I can pass some of these out. We also have and I'm happy the room is so full. So my name is Meejin, and I'm with CAF, Organizing Asian Communities, and also with Nodutdol.
My name is Seyeon Lee. I'm with Nodutdol for Korean Community Development. And we're going to talk about this new Cold War that Bill just talked about, but yeah, focusing on the so-called pivot to Asia Pacific. 안녕하세요.
I think if you go... We'll just skip them.
Okay.
I think we can go back and forth. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Bill for inviting us.
I know we know it's
to
really
be part
early in the morning and you're all here. So this is let's talk.
Yeah.
So what is the so-called pivot?
So the so-called pivot, where usually this would be like a 2-hour, like in-depth presentation, we're gonna, because we have 12 minutes, we're gonna do very brief overview, and we want to do a little more storytelling to really hit our points home for you all today. So in very, very basic terms, the so-called U.S. pivot to the Asia-Pacific region is about a rebalancing of military and economic resources from the Atlantic, so Europe and the Middle East, over to Asia and the Pacific region. And the real reasons, the U.S. has some reasons that they say, like to, basically like help these like developing nations, and we also understand the real reasons to be the U.S. economic crisis, which kind of kicked off the global economic crisis, and also about China's, the fear of China's rising economic power in the region, which threatens, obviously, like U.S. power.
Right. So even though the U.S. government says the pivot is to protect their allies from this big bad China and the scary North Korea, right, the perceived threat that Bill just talked about, but actually, the pivot is to strengthen its own hegemony in the region, the U.S. hegemony in the region, and the economy and the military, the two cannot be separated, right? Because the one cannot work without the other, and so the pivot is really about the two-pronged approach, the militaristic approach and the economic approach. So we wanted to make it interactive and ask you, what have you heard about this so-called pivot? What do you know? What are your sort of understanding? You can. Anybody? Yeah?
The U.S. Navy veteran, but one thing I have noticed in the Salah is that the U.S. Navy was once basically based in Europe and the Mediterranean, but recently they shifted most of the fleet to the Pacific. Probably 7% of the U.S. Navy fleet right now shifted to the Pacific. And you don't have to be very intelligent to know that it's because of the rise of China. They have been around since the beginning of World War II.
Right.
And it's interesting that they kept China isolated for many years wouldn't even allow it in the United Nations, but now that it is, you know,
Yeah.
it's the fastest rising power,
Yeah.
you know, in the world. But yet the contradiction with capitalism, it seems to be the U.S.'s main trading partner, along with whatever other contradictions that they have. So it's not an interesting thing to look at it, but the thing that has made me raise my eyebrows the fact that the U.S. has shifted the balance of its powerful navy, which I was once in, into the Pacific.
Yeah, because actually, I mean, the U.S. military bases in the Asia-Pacific region, they have been around for a while, right? So like the Okinawa bases in Japan.
Now the balance of it is in Asia.
Yeah, so they have been around for, you know, like over a century, but they're increasing it. So according to President Obama in, you know, the 2000 Defense Review, you know, he said the goal is for 60% of U.S. military to be relocated to the Asia-Pacific region.
Did you say 60?
60, yeah. And also economically, have you heard anything about the pivot?
Well,
The pivot was announced, was it 2011?
2012, I think, or
In any-
yeah, yeah, around that
We
time.
agree. It came at a time when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and she was making a lot of speeches in Southeast Asia, and it seemed as if the United States was trying to encourage, well, tell Southeast Asia that we're going to help you. That seemed to be, to me, the main thing, because Japan and Korea don't have anywhere else to go in a way.
well, North Korea or South Korea, both. You say Korea.
Well, when I say, it's a good point. When I say Korea, I'm referring to South Korea.
Okay.
I guess North Korea doesn't have anywhere to go either. They're kind of limited in their choices.
Right, so their goal was like South Korea and Japan have been traditionally allies of the U.S. and they wanted to create sort of like these new relationships or, you know, the new partnerships in the Southeast Asia. Is that what you were saying? Yeah.
Oh, Southeast Asia seemed to be the focus.
Yeah.
And also, U.S. and China had been kind of competing. I remember Obama was planning to attend an ASEAN meeting, and then Congress shut down the government here, so he didn't attend. China handed out $30 billion in contracts to different business relationships in Southeast Asia. When the U.S. finally went over there, they said that they had about $8 billion. So this seems to be a big part of what the U.S. is trying to do, make closer alliances with the Southeast Asian countries, business alliances anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing we have to be conscious of, and you made allusion to the fact that this whole move towards dominating the Pacific, who's going to be top dog in the Pacific, has been going on. You can trace it all the way back to World War I and going into World War II. Remember, one of the most bitter wars in history was fought between the U.S. and Japan.
Right.
Had a lot to do with dominating the Pacific. But it's continued now with the rise of China. Remember that right after World War II was over, after Japan had surrendered, where did the U.S. wind up next? In Korea. Am I right or wrong? That's why you got a North and South Korea today.
Yep.
But a lot can be said about that.
Yeah, so it has a very long history.
Yes,
but yeah, this
All the
has
way
a
back
very
to
long
the
history.
Philippines, but they dealt with the Spanish.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're going to try and keep moving, but thank you all for your comments. I know there's
Yeah.
a lot more conversation to be had. And I think just to point out on the next slide, so this is a map. Let's go to the TPP
Okay.
map really quick.
Yeah.
This is the map of something that someone kind of mentioned, I think, or maybe I was just thinking it in my head, is the TPPA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And so countries that are either part of the agreement or who would like to be a part of the agreement are highlighted in red. And notice that China is not one of those one of those countries. And so I think when we talk about like U.S. working to build out relationships with folks in Southeast Asia where they may not have existed before, also understanding kind of the bigger picture that the relationships, as Seyeon said, already existed with some folks like South Korea and Japan, and also that China is, like, despite being huge, is not a part of that agreement. I think that's pretty important
Yeah,
to know.
and we wanted to kind of note the similarity between, so this is like the economic, the partnership that they're trying to create, and this is a map of military bases in the region. So like the light blue is more than 1,000 troops, dark blue is more than 100 troops, and the purple is like the use of bases is permitted. And so yeah, you can sort of see like the similarity in like the containment. They're all around, kind of surrounding China in a way. Okay, so as we just mentioned, for the pivot to work, the U.S. needs to lean heavily on its allies, on its traditional allies like South Korea and Japan. And since we are part of the Korean diaspora, and I personally, most of my family, they live in the Korean peninsula. So we're going to talk about what the effect of this so-called pivot is on Korea. So because of, as you know, there's a huge this budget deficit. Pentagon is trying to really, reduce spending. There is this huge pressure. So then the U.S. is putting heavy pressure on the governments where they have the U.S. military bases. And basically the U.S. government is demanding the South Korean government pay more for the cost of keeping the U.S. military there, right? So the cost has been increasing steadily, and as you can see the figures here. And what's even more is that it has been recently found that the military has been sort of collecting interest on more than $1 billion worth of South Korean taxpayers' money in South Korean banks, right? So this money that the U.S. troops get from the South Korean government, they haven't been spending it. They've been just kind of putting it in the bank and making bank off of South Korean people's tax money. And so that's the financial part, but there's also other impact of the pivot.
Yeah, so in terms of military, this is an image from a trip that I took, this is me, to South Korea in 2010 with Nodutdol as part of a delegation and exposure program called KEEP. And we visited, at that time, before they had started to actually break ground, and there was just kind of protests happening by the folks whose land they're essentially taking over. The protest was about a naval base that's being built in Jeju, which is it's kind of like the Hawaii of Korea. It's an island off the southern coast, and as you can see, lots of really natural beauty, and I think in the next slide we can see the beginning of the building, since this was in 2010, and what it's doing to not just the land or whatever, but also the people who are impacted, which I think Seyeon is going to talk about.
Yeah, so Jeju Island, we also call it Island of Peace, and unlike Seoul, as you know, it's crazy development. The Jeju Island is very not developed. It's very sort of traditional, pristine, ocean, and people still have this sort of traditional way of living based on farming, based on fishing. So a lot of women actually make their living, doing deep sea diving and collecting shells and, fishing. And so this construction of naval base has been having a very destructive impact on the environment, right? All these concrete destroying the coral reef around the island, and that in effect really destroys people's livelihoods, right? Because people make their living off of the ocean, these people living on the island. And so people have been really, really heavily protesting this naval base, not only for like their values, like we want to keep our island of peace, we want to keep our peace, and we don't want, soldiers here, but also, don't, destroy our island, don't destroy our way of living. Yeah. So that was, so the first bullet point is what we just talked about, what's happening in Gangjong village in Jeju Island. And also, the second part is about the joint military exercises that happened every year between South Korean military and the U.S. military. And the U.S. military really thinks of Korea as this perfect ground for doing simulations for an event of war, right? Because the Korean War never ended. Like, the war is ongoing. And so every year they bring in troops from like all over the world, and they do sort of like these war games, these military exercises. What if this happens? Like, in this scenario, what are we gonna do? And this really raises the tension between North Korea and South Korea, because the war never ended, and the U.S. military is doing all these scenario of like regime collapse, and this has a very, very harmful effect on the people that are living there, because it's like it's always every year it's like brink of war, and this is really real on North Korean people and South Korean people.
And so we wanted to talk about kind of like the legacies of war a little bit via the kind of like stories of adoption. So I identify as an adoptee. I am adopted from Korea. And these images, this one on your left is from our 2010 trip to Korea. We met with TRAC, the Truth and Reconciliation for the adopted community in Korea, and also with members of Miss Mamma Mia, which is essentially Korean single and unwed mothers who are fighting for basically like the ability to raise their children as single moms. And on your right, both images were taken in North Korea last summer. With a war orphan who's the grandmother in the second to the left. She was orphaned at the age of 10 in 1950 at the beginning of the Korean War. And the bottom picture is we visited a baby home where we learned about how the state has taken care of its war orphans since the war, and continues to take care of orphan children and children who are not whose families are not able to afford to provide for them. And so all this kind of to say that, like, with these, when we talk about these big policies, for me sometimes it's hard to digest and think about, like, okay, how does that really impact like me as someone living in the U.S. And I understand kind of through these visits that so like increasing military presence in the region, where clearly we had done that before, and then came the Korean War, and we're still kind of living the legacies of that. Like the fact that single mothers in South Korea are not able to are not supported by the government to be able to raise their own children comes from an adoption industry that skyrocketed, that like ballooned after images of U.S. soldiers during the Korean War were being sent back to the U.S. and like American families such as my own were like, oh, we should like take care of these babies, but I'm not, I wasn't born in the 50s, and my family, despite the fact that I was born in the 80s, still kind of had that image stayed in their head. And so as I was growing up, like in her own way, like I love my family, but my mom would say like, oh, you could be starving on the streets of Korea. And I think that's not something that's unique to my experience. I've talked to a lot of other adoptees who have that same kind of like experience, and our families I think are very, very well intentioned. And also, like, our adoptive families are very well intentioned, and I think our birth families too, wanting to like give us a better life, quote unquote, whatever that means, right? In the United States. And also, I understand that as being very, very directly connected to a war that has never ended. So,
yeah. Yeah, so we wanted to make it, relevant for your lives too. So what does this, this pivot mean for the people living in the U.S.?
So in terms of military, who here knows someone very, like in your immediate family, either yourself or someone you love who has served in the military?
Yeah, I mean.
All right,
so
or has in the past, presently, or plans to in future. Maybe someone who's in high school or whatever, who has someone that they just know generally who has served in the military or plans to. All right, a good number of us, and so the point we want to make is like my brother actually joined the military after high school. He graduated in 2004, so it was right at the start of the Iraq War. He ended up being sent 2 tours to Iraq. And I understand that like him as one person, he was impacted by, everything that kind of happens, and he came back with a lot of stories. And also our entire family, we're a pretty big family, and was also impacted, like couldn't watch the news because there were names coming back every day. And so we understand that the impact is exponential in terms of like when we think about U.S. military presence in the region and kind of creating more tensions between countries.
Yeah, and also these talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that the U.S. is really pushing for, right? The U.S. really thinks that it's champion of free trade agreements, and it already has FTAs with many countries in Asia Pacific already. But they're saying that, this is going to create so many jobs, it's going to create so many opportunities for the American people. But if you look at NAFTA, which has been around for 20 years now, and that their promises then was that it was going to create jobs, it was going to improve our economy. And really, if you look at the report, I mean, I don't know if many of you have probably seen like the 20 years after NAFTA report of how that really led to American people losing many manufacturing jobs, and really how free trade agreement hurts working class people everywhere. It hurts working class people here in the U.S. It hurts working class people in Asia Pacific. So yeah, it really has harmful effect for the people living in the United States too. So our point, if you don't remember anything else, I know we gave you a lot of stories, but the point that we're making is that the U.S. military presence in Asia Pacific region aggravates and increases tension in the region, but then in turn, that increased tension, that perceived threat of China and North Korea justifies the presence of U.S. military in the region, right? So it's like a vicious circle. Like the U.S. military being in the region increases tension, the tension justifies the presence, and then it just keeps going. And then also the U.S. military presence serves the U.S. economic interests, like such as protecting the trade routes or advancing the agendas like the TPPA. And if the TPPA is passed, it's only going to increase the economic inequalities and benefit the multinational corporations. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're a little low on time, so maybe we'll just like skim through. So in terms of like what resistance looks like, this is our delegation who I talked about going in 2010 to Korea. And this is actually an exposure program that Nodutdol runs, and every summer they alternate between going to North and South Korea, taking delegations, doing report backs, like bringing the information back here to the U.S. And it's Koreans from the diaspora all over the U.S. We had someone from Canada last year. And so like doing art making and kind of like building with South Koreans and with North Koreans.
Mm-hmm. And so this is the Gangjong village that we talked about in Jeju Island, and these are pictures of villagers like literally on the like a grandpa like laying down his body in front of a tractor to stop, to try to prevent this construction from happening. And you can see like the police is blocking the protesters from the construction site, because a lot of people are, like literally like throwing their bodies to slow down the construction, but it keeps happening. It's like been a little bit slowed down, but they keep pushing for it, and the construction is currently happening right now. So, and these are pictures of the rallies that we've had. This bottom picture is the recent rally that we had in response to President Obama's visit to the Asia Pacific region.
And actually, what's being handed around right now is the statement that was released by Nodutdol Tav, Bayan, Taiwan Not for Sale, several groups that have come together to form a coalition. And so it was a really great kind of powerful turnout. The statement is really good, and we also have some resources on the back of the page. Someone made a song in Spanish about kind of like contradictory to the TPP. Thank you. If anyone wants extra copies, feel free to come and grab some. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's good. This is basically showing that, there are resistance happening, on the ground, obviously, like in Korea, like in Japan, in the Philippines, people are on the streets, protesting and saying, like, we want the U.S. military I want the U.S. military out of my country. And here, what we're trying to do is, like, these rallies, protests, in solidarity to support their movement.
So what you can do is talk about it, read the statement that we passed out. Again, we put kind of like our organizational websites, signing up for emails, because this is work that's like relatively new in terms of the coalition, and we really hope to build it out. It feels it's very powerful.
Yeah.
To do the work together.
Right. And I feel like these talks are kind of very secretive. Like the TPPA talks are very under the table, and the pivot is termed as something that's beneficial for the U.S., something that's beneficial for the region, and we really want to stress that it's harmful for the people here and also in Asia, and we encourage you to talk about it with your friends or with your family. So yeah, the resources. Okay, that's it. That's our presentation. Thank you so much.
We're actually doing a bit on time. I wanted to apologize. I forgot to mention one of our guests, Dr. Ghias Moussa from the Syrian American Forum, wasn't able to make it, and I apologize for going over my own presentation. I wanted to include some of the points that you would have made concerning Syria, at least. Next, I'd like to ask Berta from. But before we start, David, would you be able to spare a couple of pieces of white paper? I'd like to send around if anyone wants to sign up and stay in touch with any of your organizations here in the room. The list will be given to all the organizations.
Yeah, I'll offer people at very reasonable terms.
And of course, it's not compulsory.
Hi, good morning. In a way, I'm glad to follow the compañeras, Korean compañeras, because particularly the picture of Jeju remind me in the International Action Center sent a delegation to South Korea in the year 2000. That was the year that North and South, there was kind of a, the opening. It was incredible what we learned. But particularly, our delegation included, anybody has heard about Vieques, Puerto Rico? Included one of the leaders of Vieques who was fighting against the U.S. military, the Navy, particularly in Vieques, their presence, which used like Jeju. In that time, we went to the island of Meejin, which is very, very small, but it's located not at the south of South Korea, but right in the north of South Korea, right at just a few miles from North Korea. And it was horrible. And they met, but it was so moving because they met leaders of the Meejin struggle. And those boats reminded me of, that struggle. And I think that, in a way, it's an introduction of what I wanted to share with you, which is unity in action. I know I'm supposed to talk about Venezuela, but I really wanted to put Venezuela and Cuba and Latin America in a context more than, because you can read about Venezuela, you are activists, you are from the left, so you know where to look for information. I'll mention some things. But more importantly, I think I feel my duty, because I work a lot with Venezuela and Cuba and Latin America in general, to put in the context, because I don't think that Latin America is being taken in the United States movement as seriously as it should. And I think it's important. We are, for example, in New York City. And New York City is the center of imperialism. It's the finance capital. This is where all the corporations that go to South Korea, that go to Puerto Rico, that go everywhere, this is where they trade. So this is a center of the furious imperialism. And that's where the Pentagon, that's the bosses of the Pentagon. But it's also the center of revolutionaries. And I'm thinking the task of the Left Forum. This is the first time I ever come to a Left Forum. I live in Philadelphia. I'm from Puerto Rico. But I'm thinking of New York City. It has also been the center of gathering, not only of the Left Forum, but in the 1800s. Who knows the name of Jose Martín? Who knows about the name of Ramón Emeterio Betances? Very few. Who knows about Lola Rodríguez de Tío? Lola Rodríguez de Tío and Ramón Emeterio Betances were Puerto Ricans. And Jose Martí, it's the independence. It's like the father of Cuba, fighting against the Spaniards at that time. The same thing was Betances for Puerto Rico. And Lola Rodríguez de Tío, she's the one who not only was a fighter, but she was a poet, and she wrote the lyrics of the revolutionary anthem of Puerto Rico, which you don't hear in the official celebrations where they, where they play the anthem of Puerto Rico. The lyrics are really revolutionary, and even include Cuba, because Cuba and Puerto Rico from that time were really, really tight. And she's the one who, I don't know if you've heard, Cuba y Puerto Rico son de un pájaro las dos alas. Cuba and Puerto Rico are two wings of the same bird, because our struggle were tight. Well, they met in where? In New York City. They have a part of the Cuban party, Revolutionary Party, had a branch in New York, and that's how they met. So New York historically has served as this center also for revolutionaries. And I think that it's so important for us to think about, and because the importance of political gatherings like the Left Forum have to rise to the occasion. I think that the attacks on people everywhere, working class, including the United States, and particularly in the United States, is so big, so criminal, that we have to use any space that we have political gatherings. We have to convert that theory into action. We don't have the luxury just going home and, oh, that was interesting, that was good, and I go back and watch TV or do my job. Or we have to turn that into action, because otherwise we are going to be extinct. And that is, and I include the attacks against the environment and the attacks of working people all over, and particularly here. It's the capitalist crisis is not going to get better. It's getting worse, and there is no recovery. There are no jobs. The attacks on education, the attacks on public workers, the attack on unions, and I'm talking about in this country. So it's like how we have to unite. We have divergent political ideologies. That's fine. We don't have to think the same. We don't have in terms of different parties, different organizations, but we need what it's called. And this is what it's talked a great deal in all the gatherings in Latin America. And it's unity in action. And unity in action, it's like what Vieques and Meejin Richard did. It's fighting together. Then people from Vieques and Puerto Rico knew about South Korea that they didn't know. The militarization is the same military for the purposes of the corporation. So I think that this is a time that it's not only that it requires action, it requires mobilization and unity in diversity, our diverse organization. So the one thing, if we ask ourselves, and going to the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, what region in the world right now is challenging the United States imperialism and taking concrete steps to reduce and stop its domination? Can you tell me? Where?
Russia?
Russia? I hear and read a lot about Ukraine, and you would think that that's the region in the world that is challenging mostly imperialism. There are places, and South Korea, they're challenging imperialism. I'm not saying that there are no places, they are challenging in Africa. But as a region that is concentrated, that many countries and many organizations are challenging imperialism.
See, this is far back as I can remember, elements in Latin America, especially South America, have been challenging U.S. imperialism. And Cuba was the one that really succeeded, I think, in opening up the whole door and avalanche of challenges to U.S. imperialism in Latin America.
Exactly.
That's why they hate Cuba so much, the imperialists. Even before the success of the Cuban Revolution, they were challenging U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, like Jose Marti.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In South America.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been an old, as a matter of fact, Che Guevara was killed in South America, fighting U.S. imperialism. But I remember it's been a long struggle. I do remember that. And I remember all of the propaganda that they used to level against revolutionaries in South America.
Exactly. You work with?
And of course, there's always the unknown struggle, the one that is always forgotten. The minute U.S. troops are not involved, they're always forgotten. The minute that nobody in the United States is getting killed, always forgotten. The minute that there's no U.S. direct presence, but that is the war in. I thought so. Iraq. Always forgotten. And there is a very strong resistance movement there. Iraq has been stateless since 2003. It remains stateless today. There remains a very strong resistance movement. Maliki is only temporary. He's very fragile. The war is continuing at the same rate as ever. Just as many Iraqis are dying as ever. And nobody, you never hear him mentioned.
It's true. There are many struggles all around the world in the Middle East, and we shouldn't forget Palestine. That's like predominant. But as a region where many more countries, and compañero mentioned Cuba, what region in the world right now has more countries trying to build anti-capitalist, pro-socialist, or socialist societies? Latin America. What region in the world right now is trying to build new countries associations to challenge U.S. domination, like ALBA, CELAC, and so forth, without the presence of United States and Canada? Which region? Latin America. So it's like if you answer three of this, Latin America, and it is. Where is the region where the United States have received more defeats? We're talking about attacks of the United States and imperialism. But let's talk also of defeats, even though they are small. But defeating imperialism, defeating and winning a little battle is very significant, it's very important. So which region has defeated more against U.S. imperialism? Kicking out the United States military base of Manta, which was in Ecuador, and Vieques, even though Puerto Rico is still a colony. But we kicked out Vieques. We kicked out the Navy in Vieques and Roosevelt Road. Who has been kicking out McDonald's out of the country? In Bolivia. Kicking out U.S. diplomats that are really CIA agents. That has been several countries. right now in September, Ecuador will kick out completely the USA, which is a really terrorist organization, because that's what the U.S. embassies are, a terrorist organization, nothing about diplomacy. Building socialism under the nose of the United States, the compañero mentioned, Cuba, and now Venezuela. And speaking out loudly and clearly against U.S. multiple attacks. You hear all these other presidents of all the other countries that, they might disagree with the United States, but they are so, so diplomatic, and it's like U.S. Well, when you hear Correa, when you heard before Chavez, they put the name. It's like it's stupid. And remember when Chavez went to the UN and told about, the devil was here. I smell sulfur. They tell the things, and not only the governments, but it's the peoples, because even in Colombia, which is a right-wing government, the people are rising up as never before. There are many struggles. And the United States continues attacking. So I think it's and who deals, for example, new trade with China, regardless of what we think of China or not. Latin America has a strong relation and trade with China is increasing. And the United States is not. It's decreasing the trade with the Latin America. And China is increasing, and Russia is increasing. And who just signed a deal with Palestine to provide oil and diesel? It was Venezuela, and now it's Petro-Palestine. This is really unity. This is really solidarity. So I'm going now to the last part, which is Latin America and the Caribbean. There are several points that I wanted to raise. One is the imperialist attack. The United States cannot stand that this is the region that is challenging. It's challenging the corporations. It's challenging imperialism. It's challenging the very existence of the United States. As Simón Bolívar said, United States, how we say it in English, I have to write it. Estados Unidos parecía, the United States seemed to be destined by the providence to bring misery to the Americas. And Americas, I don't refer to the United States as America. It's North America, Central America, and South America. And that is the slogan that is being used and fought for in Latin America. They see the United States as this force that has to be not only reckoned with, but has to be defeated. And I think the movements there, and these movements are not just the movement from even 20 years ago. These are not the Communist Party. These are not the parties that say. These are new elements that are being politicized and taking protagonist role, like Afro-descendants, what is called Afro-descendants, which is Afro-Colombians and in any other. And the indigenous, we were completely invisible, just like the indigenous native people in this country. It happened also in Latin America because the bourgeoisie was the same one. The bosses were the same ones, where the capitalists were the white. Well, now this is changing, and this is changing. And so I'm not talking only about the progressive governments of Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, now El Salvador, and etc., Nicaragua. But it's also those who still don't have a progressive government have this progressive movement. So the whole region is moving to the left. I'm not saying they are all socialists, but they are not anti-communist. And many of the leading organizations are socialists or very pro-socialist. And then if you come to the United States and see, the compañeras mentioned NAFTA, were you the ones who mentioned NAFTA? What the other aspect of NAFTA is this increase of migrants from Mexico because of particularly it was small agriculture, small farmers, because they destroyed the corn industry, and they started all this transgenic corn by Monsanto. And that made so many immigrants, particularly Mexicans, come to the United States. And what happened in 2006 in this country? Anybody remember 2006? May 1st, 2006? There was a general strike. May Day, the origin of May Day was in this country, yet it was not celebrated in this country. This country had what? The Labor Day, which unions have a picnic and all that, but don't celebrate the struggle. But the immigrants in 2006 resuscitated May Day, and now you see in many cities, now May Day is being celebrated. Not as in many countries. I was just in Cuba for May Day. There were 1 million people. It was awesome. I mean, if I can, but it was 1 million, and that happens all over Latin America. Now it's when this is celebrated, and it's celebrating the struggle of workers, because workers now are being under attack. And it was the immigrant community, the one that infused blood and energy into the labor movement now. And now you can see how unions have to embrace immigrants. They are not doing what it needs to be done, but it's been, and it's the immigrant struggle, the one that has made that. So having solidarity and struggling with the people in Latin America, not just a little solidarity, let me write a statement in support and all that. No, it's like, for example, the General Motors, the corporations that are here from the United States that are oppressing and closing plants here are exploiting the workers there. What about workers from Colombia, which has happened? Workers from Colombia and workers from and we have from Detroit. We have compañeras that have worked together with the General Motors workers from Detroit and other places here to be in solidarity with the workers in Colombia and working together, struggling together. That's what it needs in solidarity in action, unity in action, but not only unions, but the social movement. And it's, so I think it's crucial to understand the role of the region in the context of the struggle here, because also working with the immigrant community here is also working in support of the struggles in Latin America. And I admit, in the immigrant community, you have from the right to the left, but mostly it's vanguard, and the ones who pushes in the right direction are more from the left, are more progressive. So I think it's very important to embrace the workers here, and also I'm talking about the low wage. The immigrants are low wage workers. It's not like low wage workers here and immigrants here. They are part of the low wage, and here the wages are being pushed down for everybody. So I think that is important. And then building socialism. In Cuba, as the compañero said, Cuba has been the force of building socialism, and now Venezuela is carrying that. We have also, and I think, and I wanted to raise this because sometimes we in the left movement are so critical. Oh, Cuba should be doing this, or this is not right, and this is that, this is doing. Hey, they are there. They have kept that struggle in Cuba against imperialism, against the US. So they are doing something really good. And Cuba right now is a center of so many conferences. I was there from May 28th through, from April 28th through May 7th. I don't remember how many conferences I went. But one key, of course, the May Day was just a feat. It was just a realization that people are defending the revolution, that there is no hype like the government here says, well, the government pays a boss and bosses people now. That is not true. I remember that the CTC, the Central of Workers, came to pick us up at the hotel at 5 a.m, because if you go after 5, all the streets are closed. And you could see people coming. It's like so dark at that morning, and it was wrote, it looked like it was 12 in the afternoon, because all the people coming to, to the parade. But there was another essential meeting, which was a 2-day labor conference. And that was the most militant unions from Central and South America. And it's called el ESNA, Encuentro Sindical de Nuestra América. Who speaks Spanish here? Okay, good. I thought you did. Is the gathering of labor of our America. That would be the translation. And this was set up by Chavez in 2005 because he thought it was necessary for the workers, for the working class to fight together, that it couldn't be just in one country and another country, that they had to band together. And they have been meeting every year since then, every 2 years since then. This is the 6th ESNA gathering. And they meet, like for sector, like the construction workers of all the ESNA, they meet at between one ESNA and the other, and the particularly industry meet, and they band together, not just for solidarity, but struggling together. And one of the things that the resolutions that they had is like August 1st, and I hope that you can carry this when you go back to your place. August 1st is a Friday, and it's a day of solidarity, not only solidarity, but to defend the Venezuelan revolution, because they think that right now, the most important thing is to defend Venezuela. Cuba also, but Cuba is a long time, revolutionary center. Venezuela is just starting, and the United States is putting so much to destroy it. And there is this media campaign that is just lies, complete lies, that we have to expose. And that's very important. Somebody, I think you mentioned about the troops in Iraq. And one of the things that the attacks in the United States right now against Cuba and Venezuela is not troops, it's not military, even though they have increased military in Colombia alone. There are 9 bases, 5 bases in the last few years, and they are increasing, the Pacific Fleet and all that. So there is increase in military. But the attacks are being used is the social media. The high technology has affected the new way that the United States is attacking. And because it's something that you don't see it, that it's not as dramatic, and I wouldn't say bloodless, because in Venezuela, 42 people have been killed by the opposition. But in Cuba, also they are using the social media. The latest, and there are many, but the latest is called Sunsuneo. This is paid by the USA, by the US Embassy, by the US government, that they have this software, Sunsuneo, which, because the internet is not as wide in Cuba because of the blockade, the youth, particularly the youth, use texting. And they send this texting to all the youth that subscribe to Sunsuneo. And basically is to subvert the government, and is directed to the youth. They are doing the same thing in Venezuela. And this is a real attack that they are doing in terms of the media, and we have to expose this. So I think that the social media and the high technology as the new way of attack that has to, and it's very cruel. It's not something like, and it doesn't compare to the bloody, troops, but that has to be exposed. So what is the concrete actions that are happening now? And here I see Bill is looking at me like it's time to finish. But who knows about the June 4th to June 11 action in Washington, D.C. about Cuba? We're activists. Why don't we know about it? I know Pam and Ramona know. Why don't, no, and I'm not criticizing the activists, but I'm asking, of those who don't know, can you tell me why not?
Well, I think this might be cruel, and no offense. But I think Time and effort is a commodity that you have to spend wisely. And where you put your time and effort has to be on campaigns that you think are believable. You believe are successful, are strong campaigns, are strong movements, and have the chance to succeed.
Okay, bro, let me tell you off. We have 2 more presenters. We have 30
Okay, I'll finish, but this is very important because this is defense of Cuba right now in Washington. There are actions between June 4th to June 11th. In June 4th, Dead Press is having an awesome concert with Zimbabwe. The Union of Africa and Cuba, that has been, and we can, but it's Cuba and Africa. It's awesome. But the 7th, if you don't go to anything else, try on the 7th. There is a rally in front of the White House at 1 p.m. Try to organize, because that is defending Cuba right now is crucial. It's very crucial. And Venezuela, August 1st. Do anything, even if it's a press release, even if it's just handing out information, but do something about Venezuela to counteract the media campaign and now the sanctions that the United States is trying to impose. So that is, and also political prisoners. Remember the peace negotiations of Colombia. Simón Trinidad is as a political prisoner, as Oscar Lopez, as Mumia, as Leonel Peltier, as the Cuban Five. And we have to keep the political prisoners in mind. Thank you. I'm sorry to take.
Everyone stands here by the Venezuelan consulate on 12 on East 51st Street between 12 and 6 p.m. is a beautiful exhibit of freedom fighters and revolutionaries from Latin America and the Caribbean. Our next speaker will be Abayomi from Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice in Detroit and the Pan-African Youth Bar.
Thank you very much, Brother Bill. The topic of my presentation this morning will be asking the question, is there a new Cold War that impacts Africa? And what is behind the imperialist war drive on the continent? And from my own perspective, the Cold War was and is a reflection of the global class war. The struggle between socialism to build socialism throughout the world, and the role of the national liberation movements and progressive movements, even within the imperialist states on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, imperialism itself, which manifests itself through world capitalism. Now, many people today are describing the renewed political and military tensions between the Russian Federation and the United States European Union alliance as a manifestation of the so-called, quote, new Cold War, end quote. The previous Cold War developed after the conclusion of World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the major powers on the international scene. Coinciding with the Cold War between approximately 1947 and 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, was the rise of the national liberation movements in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America, but also the struggles for civil rights and empowerment and social justice in the Western countries during the same time period. Now, the Cold War did not only have a foreign policy implication, it also influenced the character of oppression and class exploitation, as well as race relations inside the imperialist states themselves. Now, the question of a Cold War cannot be fully answered without dealing with the political character of international racism in the overall world capitalist ideological and military struggle against communism. That's very important to take into account, because after World War II, there was a wholesale attack on the left in the United States. And some of the individuals and organizations that bore the brunt of that attack were based in the African American community. W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, had his passport seized. They attempted to frame him on trumped-up charges about being an agent of a foreign power. Claudia Jones, for example, not well-known African-American communist who lived here in New York City, who was originally from Trinidad, was defended in the 1951 treason case along with Gurley Flynn and many others. She was deported. She spent a year in prison and was deported from the United States to England in 1955. William Patterson, who wrote the We Charge Genocide petition, was a member of the Communist Party. He was involved in the Civil Rights Congress. He's presented a petition charging the United States with genocide against African Americans during 1951, along with Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, during the course of World War II, the peoples of the oppressed nations were thrust into a protracted conflict by demanding both social equality as well as national independence. So the contradiction within world wars of the 20th century is that they sparked resistance all over the world, World War I and World War II. Now, in October of 1945, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there was a 5th Pan-African Congress held in Manchester, England. It was one of the largest of such gatherings throughout the 20th century. People like W.E.B. Du Bois was the chairperson of that meeting. Kwame Nkrumah, who later became leader of the African independence struggle based in Ghana, was the secretary. George Padmore, who had been with the Communist Party here in the United States and internationally, was the chief organizer of the conference. The meeting represented the apex of a series of similar gatherings that were organized between 1893, where there was considered the first Pan-African Congress in Chicago, and another Pan-African conference that was held in London in 1900 that Du Bois was involved in, Anna Julia Cooper, and many others. After the turn of the 19th and the 20th centuries, there was an upsurge in national consciousness as well as class struggle throughout the world. The Niagara Movement in 1905, that was headed by W.E.B. Du Bois, led directly to the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, that was co-founded by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as Mrs. Ida B. Wells Barnett, somebody who was an African-American woman organizer against lynchings in the South. She settled in Memphis, and she opposed very militantly the wholesale racial violence against African Americans. You know, there were 5,000 African Americans lynched in the United States by mobs between the 1880s and the Great Depression of the 1930s and 40s. Both of these prominent African American leaders were militant opponents of racism in the United States, where African Americans were being lynched in the hundreds every year during this period. Now, with the conclusion of World War I, a previous upsurge in national consciousness also arose. Another Pan-African Congress was held in 1919 in Paris in the immediate aftermath of the war. Du Bois became the chief proponent of these congresses, these summits, which took place in 1921. There was another one in 1923, another one in 1925. These were all in Europe. And then in 1927, there was a 4th Pan-African Congress that was held right here in New York City, which was the largest of such gatherings up until that time period. Some 5,000 people attended the 4th Pan-African Congress here in New York in 1927, and it was organized by African-American women. A group called the Circle for Peace and Foreign Relations organized this conference because Du Bois was very pessimistic at this time. He didn't think the gathering was possible, but they were able to organize this conference in New York in 1927. Also, we had the Universal Negro Improvement Associations, the African Communities League, the UNIA, that was founded by Marcus Garvey and his first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey, who was a very profound organizer and a leftist who moved further to the left after she broke with Garvey. This organization drew millions of members and supporters throughout the Western states and within occupied and colonial territories in Africa and Central America and South America, as well as the African continent. A lot of people are not aware that the UNIA had chapters in Panama and other areas in Central America. They also had South American chapters, and they also had chapters on the African continent in Namibia, which was then known as Southwest Africa. Trade unions were formed in various parts of Africa during this period. For example, in the Gold Coast, which later became Ghana, they organized a railway workers' union as early as 1939. Then you had the Industrial and Commercial Workers' Union in South Africa that developed after World War I. It was headed by a man by the name of Kadali, who was actually from Malawi, but he was a migrant worker in South Africa. Then there was a Rand Miners strike of 1946 in South Africa, which drew a lot of support from this country through people like Du Bois and Alpheus Hunton, who were part of the Congress on African Affairs that had its office right here in New York. And it was connected, too, to the Communist Party. In 1919, after World War I, there was a series of so-called race riots in the United States. And in those days, when you had race riots, it's not what you consider race riots today. In those days, race riots were white mobs, along with the police, that would go into the African-American community and rape, rob, burn, and destroy until they got tired. And there was a series of race riots across the United States in 1919. What distinguished the race riots in 1919 was that after World War I, many African-American men had gone into the war and fought in France. They had military training, and they were made more militant as a result of the war. So there were organized fightbacks during that time period. It changed the whole course of race relations in the United States. Also in Egypt in 1919, there was an uprising that brought millions of people into the streets in Egypt, including women who played a vanguard role in the so-called 1919 revolution in Egypt, which led to a somewhat neo-colonial system in the early 1920s in Egypt. Now, the national liberation movements achieving independence in Africa and the gains of the civil rights and black power movements in the United States had a profound impact on the character of world capitalism and imperialism. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who I mentioned earlier, from Ghana, who studied here in the United States for a decade during the Great Depression and during World War I, was the founder of the modern state of Ghana, and he was the chief tactician and strategist of the African Revolution during the 1950s all the way through the time he died in the early 1970s. He identified neocolonialism, a new form of colonialism, as the principal impediment to the achievement of genuine liberation and economic development. Okay, they take down the Union Jack, they take down the imperialist flags, they put up the national flags, but in terms of the economies of the emergent states, they're still impacted by imperialism. Even where there's been revolutions, there's still class struggles that go on within these societies. We can see it in Venezuela today. We can see it in Syria today. We can see it in Ecuador, even in Cuba. So the struggle is ongoing in that particular regard. After World War II, the U.S. capitalists consolidated their global hegemony. Europe had been destroyed by the war. The Soviet Union lost 28 million people during the war. So the U.S., which did not experience any real fighting inside the country, there were race riots during World War II, but it largely remained intact, and they were able to consolidate their hegemony over the world economy after World War II. Nonetheless, periodic crises within the economic system of exploitation were never fully resolved. People credit World War II with bringing the United States out of the Depression. But since World War II, there have been periodic economic downturns inside the United States and throughout the capitalist world. Even with the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the shifts within the domestic and foreign policy of the People's Republic of China, beginning in the early 1970s, of course, the normalization of relations after 1979 between the People's Republic of China and the United States, as well as other socialist countries. The ruling class inside the U.S. and Western Europe are by no means socially secure. So even though the Soviet Union has collapsed, even though China today, it still bears the brunt of a lot of antagonism by the United States, but they do not have the same position that they had between 1949 and 1979 in terms of international affairs and even the way the internal economy inside China is organized and structured. But despite all of these contradictions within the socialist camp, the U.S. has still not resolved its contradictions in regard to how the capitalist system is structured. The declining rate of profits and the ongoing resistance of the working class and the nationally oppressed have continued to be a cause of concern by those who control the means of production and the state within the U.S. as well as the imperialist countries. The ongoing domestic war against the working class and the oppressed inside the United States is an evidence through the attacks on public employees, public assets, unions, municipal pension funds, public and low-income housing, and the evisceration of public education, both the K-12 education as well as colleges and universities. Where I'm from in Detroit, we're waging a hell of a struggle right now against the banks and against the corporations which are trying to wipe out the unions. They're trying to seize pension funds. They're privatizing public assets. They've essentially taken the right to vote away from the majority African-American population in Detroit and other majority African-American municipalities throughout the state. Today, China is considered by the United States imperialists as a major impediment to their control of various geopolitical regions of the world, including the Asia-Pacific region, and the African continent as well. Developments in Africa have landed China the status of being the largest trading partner with the continent. They have the Conference on China-Africa Cooperation, which has had 5 meetings since 2000. And these relationships are enhancing. Also, there is the Africa-South America Summit, which has had 3 meetings. So they're coming closer together as well. In relationship to the role of the Russian Federation in the United States engineered coup in Ukraine in February, and the utilization of these fascist organizations is by no means unique. Many of these same fascist elements were recruited by the United States after World War II, where they played a role in framing the political character of the intellectual and political nature of contemporary society. Many of these fascists and Nazis were brought here to the United States. They participated in the space program. They were in the universities. When I was a student in the 70s, a lot of the professors that taught Eastern European studies and Soviet studies were pro-imperialists, okay? Now, the present hostility directed against China and Russia is a clear reflection of the crisis within the imperialist system of the United States. By attempting to demonize and criminalize the governments of China and the Russian Federation, the ruling class and the state are extending their domestic policies used against the oppressed nations inside the United States, who are disproportionately represented through the prison systems, also under law enforcement and judicial supervision. So it's a domestic war here against the oppressed and the working class here in the United States, which is a manifestation of this so-called New Cold War. Nonetheless, these efforts by the ruling class have not halted the struggle for liberation, social justice, socialism, and peace. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Somalia, in the Philippines, in Sudan, and all throughout South America and the Caribbean, the imperialists have not been able to win an outright victory in any of these struggles. They cause a lot of havoc, they create a lot of social dislocation and misery, but they have not been able still today to consolidate their hegemony. Now, in conclusion, I just wanted to say, efforts to reshape society and the world are very much in order in light of what is going on right now. People need food. They need housing. Look at the mortgage crisis since 2007. It's displaced millions of people across the United States. Rents are skyrocketing right now. People need medical care. We don't have national health insurance here in the United States. This Affordable Care Act is not affordable. Public education is under attack. We need a safe environment for people to live in. It's being constantly destroyed. In Detroit, they have this tar sands controversy, where they're putting all this toxic waste on the areas in southwest Detroit that's causing diseases and evacuations in these areas. And we need political independence as well. Capitalism cannot provide these things that are essential needs for the modern world. Only the socialist reorganization of the economy and the political structures of societies international can provide hope and reasonable prospects for a world based upon social justice, self-determination, and genuine equality. This realization continues to be the preoccupation of progressive forces in the struggle to achieve these advancements throughout the world. And I want to end there, and maybe we can take up some more of these issues as we have a question and answer period. Thank you so much.
Our final speaker, Jess Sundin, Minnesota.
Thanks, y'all. Nice to see you, and I appreciate the opportunity to join the discussion. I was thinking about this topic and realizing that I was a schoolgirl in the final years of the Cold War, and I grew up fearing mutually assured destruction. It seemed imminent, less imminent, I should say, than my mother's duck and cover youth, but it also seemed pretty absolute and final. And in fact, this is something a lot of people that don't know about me, but my first political action ever was to send a ham radio message to President Ronald Reagan asking him to disarm.
Wow.
In reply, I received an autographed photo of him on a horse. And I set that memory next to where what I understand about events today. And the term Cold War, it's reminiscent, but it seems inaccurate as well. The younger activists that I work with today in the anti-war movement have no sense of doom like the apocalypse that I once feared. And while I still see nuclear arms in my mind's eye when Kerry or Obama or McCain rattle their sabers at Russia, I understand it's not the same conflict the world witnessed from the end of World War II until the fall of the Soviet Union. Today we see, on the one hand, rising capitalist Russia, independent of the West, and prepared to defend its interests against the United States and NATO encroachments. And on the other, we have the United States and its NATO allies unable to claim victory in a single imperial adventure. I think others have mentioned this: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Iran. In none of these places has the West been able to defeat its adversaries and install stable allies. And with every defeat, they become more desperate, and their capacity to profit and exploit is in greater, ever-growing danger. That said, I'm actually going to focus on what some of the Cold War looks like here at home. The United States, as we all know, it's ruled by vampires that have no shame. It's our history. The country was founded on stolen land, on the backs of stolen people, by exploiting the labor of working people, especially African slaves, and super-exploited immigrant workers. Brutal war after brutal war have seized control of other nations' wealth time and again. Banksters and bosses are protected even when they steal the jobs, homes, and safety net that thousands of working people need for our survival. And laws are passed that limit our rights to organize and pave the way for environmental destruction. Those in power have an insatiable thirst for profit and domination. Like I said, they're vampires with no shame. And that's why it's no surprise that when they act out against those who see that another world is possible and who dare to fight for it. And that this is the face of the Cold War at home, a face of ruthless political repression. Some of you I know, and many of you I do not. Those of you who don't know me may not understand how I became somewhat of a specialist on political repression. It happened in September of 2010, when some 70 FBI agents in 6 different field offices carried out coordinated raids and visits, as they're sometimes called, on myself and more than a dozen anti-war and international solidarity activists, some of us members of Freedom Road Socialist organization, as part of an effort to manufacture a case against us on charges of material support to terrorism. The government targeted us like it had so many Arabs and Muslims before us in an effort to silence dissent and clear the way for imperialist wars abroad. In all that day, 9 homes were raided, and ultimately 23 people were subpoenaed to a grand jury. None of us have testified there. Later, Chicano movement leader Carlos Montes, another of our associates, was targeted, and the case against him we beat. And now a new case has been brought against another colleague, Rasmia Odeh, a 66-year-old Palestinian leader of Chicago's Arab community. And the case against her is tied to her arrest and imprisonment by Israel in 1969. After her arrest for an alleged involvement in a bombing by the Israeli military, Rasmia was forced to confess under pressure of unspeakable physical and sexual torture. She has always maintained her innocence of the charges, but nonetheless was convicted by the Israeli military court, a court which, as it happens, has a 99% conviction rate. This is the justice of an army illegally occupying Palestine with the full backing of the United States. In October, after 20 years in the United States, Rasmia was, and 40 years after these events I just told you about, Rasmia was awakened at her home by federal law enforcement agents, taken to a courtroom in Chicago where she was charged with unlawful procurement of naturalization for allegedly lying on immigration application questions back in 1994. Again, 20 years later. According to the U.S. Attorney, Rasmia had failed to mention her arrest by Israel over 40 years earlier. But her case is not about immigration fraud. It's about silencing the Palestinian cause. Her indictment reads like a terrorism indictment. There's nothing about paperwork in it. It's about the liberation forces in Palestine and the struggle against the Zionist occupiers. It's about terrorism. And what that really means is it's about criminalizing the Palestinian liberation struggle. And when we talk about U.S. foreign policy, we cannot forget the relationship it has to repression. And Rasmia's case exemplifies this. It's one of many, but it's the one that I'm focused on right now. If she's found guilty, Rasmia could face up to 10 years in federal prison, an immediate revocation of her citizenship, and deportation from the United States. This is unacceptable, and we're mobilizing to be with her at her trial in Detroit. So I'll be seeing you in October on the 21st. Until then, we're going to be pressuring around her, pressuring that her case be dropped against her be dropped altogether. And you can follow her case at stopfbi.net, or I'm going to pass around these flyers. I'll do this on this side. And what I want to say here is, in the context of a declining and desperate empire, internationalism, solidarity, and opposition to war are always linked to the struggle against oppression. As conscious forces in any of the people's movements, we have a responsibility to stand by those who are targeted for resisting empire. We're all these targets. We're all Rasmia. I wanted to say one last thing. I was kind of struggling for exactly where my place was on this panel, but I wanted to share some of my own experiences having had the opportunity to travel to a couple of places around the world. One of the first places that I had the chance to visit was Iraq, actually. And it was from the Iraqi people that I learned about the Palestinian struggle and the key importance of it for U.S. empire in the Middle East. In fact, Israel is like its lone outpost against a very unfriendly region that is not interested in being, where its people are not interested in being dominated by the United States. But in Iraq, I remember I had the opportunity to visit Al-Amriya, which is a bomb shelter. Had some people here have maybe heard of Al-Amriya? So when I was in high school is when the war against Iraq was carried out. And this bomb shelter in Baghdad, one smart bomb after another, two of them came in the early morning hours, and everyone inside was killed. It was a shocking experience to see. The shadows of people were on the walls, still in the shelter, burned there. People had been incinerated. Others had been boiled when the water main, broke, and that water was heated, superheated. The people that I met in Iraq, I was in a delegation, perhaps with some of you, was folks from the IAC were one of the organizations that brought us there. There was like 100 people from the United States coming to Baghdad in 1998. The United States was no better friend to the Iraqi people then than it is today. We go to this bomb shelter where we've seen one of the most unspeakable crimes of war. All of us Americans. And you know what the people there said to us? They said that we don't hate you, we hate your government. And that has to be at the core of our perspective when we look around the world. It is not ours to judge the governments of other nations, but rather to unite with working and oppressed people who are just like us, who don't deserve to have their homes bombed, their bomb shelters bombed, their family members killed in the interests of war and profit. I also am reminded of the time that I had the chance to meet with some compañeros from the struggle in Colombia. We actually met in neighboring Ecuador, and they talked about the Iraqi struggle. They said, the resistance in Iraq has been decisive for us in Colombia. And it was something I had never considered. These are places far away from each other. Even though I had been to Iraq, and it was something I knew about and I was very interested in and support of the struggle in Colombia. But the fact is that every time the U.S. is tied down in one of these battles, it gives space for other movements to grow and to fight back. And the fact is that our enemy is the same. Our enemy for every one of us in all the people's movements is empire and the theft and the murder that it carries out. And so our task is to maintain that unity with the world's people. And so when the declining empire of the United States continues to lash out, to paint new enemies or renewed enemies in China or Russia, our task is not to judge or assess the relative merits or demerits of China or Russia, but to impose our own imperial rulers. The threat against us is, in fact, the same threat that the people of the world face. And so I am honored to share my thoughts on this topic with you. And hopefully none of us will be having to duck and cover anytime soon, and instead we'll be out in the streets leading the fights for justice.
this country is ruled by vampires. Let's be clear, we're not talking Twilight Zone, we're talking Nosferatu. Those raids that Jess described, they were not knocks on the door. They were battering rams, snipers on the roof, men in black and masks coming through the door, smashing everything, tearing everything apart. It was like Palestine. And I want to acknowledge we also have in this room a sister who's experienced the worst of the war at home, Ramona Africa, who was one of the survivors of the Osaki street bombing in the Philadelphia Police Department, burned alive, 11 people, dropping 5 children when they dropped bombs on the MOVE headquarters in Philadelphia in 1985.
And nobody's held accountable. Nobody. The only person go to jail is me. You're a survivor.
And they shot people trying to force them back into the fire. Technically, we're at the end of our time, but I don't know, maybe, are you coming, is there another panel here right now?
If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. I'd hammer out danger, I'd hammer out a warning, I'd hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters. Whoa, this land. Well, if I had a bell, I'd bring it in the morning, I'd bring